This is the Reading Instruction Show. I'm your host, Dr. Andy Johnson. This is part two of a podcast looking at words and words matter. We must hold scholars accountable for the words that they use. And in this podcast or show, we're going to look at propositions, variables, and baloney. Review some common tricks used to create convenient inaccuracies, and I've added a couple. An academic buzzword is used to create the illusion of something important. Buzzwords are used to elicit an emotional response rather than accurately transmitting information. A cow pie is the term used to indicate a pile of academic buzzwords wired together to create conveniently inaccurate perceptions. Weasel word. Words used to give the impression of something without really saying something. Straw man argument, creating a cartoon and then arguing against the cartoon. Two new words, baloney. Creatively interpreting or misinterpreting research or decontextualized data. And proposition-heavy writing, cramming an inordinate number of propositions into a sentence. These are all used to create inaccurate perceptions of things. We are focusing on baloney in this part two, because baloney harms students, teachers, and public education. We must be vigilant. We must be responsible consumers of educational research and information. And baloney damages our field. So let's take a look at this article written by Claude Goldenberg, and there was a little bit of baloney here. Part two, Goldenberg referenced two research studies to make the case for a particular type of reading instruction, and you can see the two citations there, the two studies. Now, Goldenberg cited these studies to support 21 propositions. Saying it so doesn't make it so. Again, scholars do not get a free pass. They should not get a free pass on obfuscation and deception. We must call them out just because they use big words and pretty words. They do not get a free pass on these tricks to create conveniently inaccurate perceptions of things. Now, this is what Goldenberg said. As with Vaughan's intervention, Erie's included explicit and systematic instruction of targeted knowledge and skills and daily lessons that include activities focused on the 5 core skills of phonological awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. The intervention also included significant attention to developing oral language and integrating oral language and vocabulary knowledge into the reading process. Oh my gosh, what does that mean? Sounds important, doesn't it? Sounds very important. Pretty words, explicit and systematic instruction, targeted knowledge and skills, 5 core skills, oral, pretty words, but it's all conveniently inaccurate. He went on to say both interventions included principles of early reading instruction consistent with findings from research on the science of reading. And again, what are these? What are the principles of early reading instruction? Who declared them to be principles? What research on the science of reading? You can't just say stuff, Claude. In describing the results, he said, effects were moderate to large on measures of English phonological awareness, word reading, decoding, reading and comprehension text. Both interventions included principles of early reading instruction, consistent with research from the science of reading. Both incorporated oral English language designed as blah, 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 blah. What the hell? So let's deconstruct those sentences. There was 270 words there, used to create 7 sentences. And there were 21 propositions found within these 7 sentences. And if you deconstruct them, one is led to believe that these two studies supported these 21 propositions. There was research-based evidence to support these 7 things. But that is untrue. These two studies provided research-based evidence to support daily lessons that included activities focused on those 5 things. But that is false, and I'll be showing you that. These two studies provided research-based evidence to support giving significant attention to those 4 things. But if you look at the 2 studies, you see that is wrong. In the field of reading instruction, these are principles. And if you look, that is incorrect. It's just not true. The 2 studies cited by Goldenberg supported none of those propositions. Some of the words they used included, some of the descriptors used in the studies included words that were included in the proposition, but often these words were inaccurate, incomplete, or illusory. And I have a full analysis of these 2 studies somewhere else, but none of the words used to indicate the 21 propositions were variables that were isolated and compared in these 2 studies. And that's important because he's giving the illusion, the convenient inaccuracy, the convenient inaccurate perception that research supports these 21 propositions. Now, why is isolating variables is important? In controlled experimental research, and the science of reading says that's the only kind that can be used to make decisions. That's used to determine if one thing caused another thing to occur. The variable, there's a causal factor. You can say that one thing caused the other to occur. To do this, you start with 2 similar groups, and they're exposed to equal conditions. The treatment or the variable varies. That's the only difference between the treatment and control groups. And at the end, if there's a difference between the groups on some measure, you can say with a certain bit of confidence that the treatment was the cause of the difference. That's why it is important. Now, here's an example. Let's say I had a cage color experiment. My research question was, does the color of the mouse cage cause mice to gain weight? I want that that's my research question. I'm looking for the causal factor. Now, in this research, I had a blue cage, but I gave all the mice marshmallows to eat there. And I had a yellow cage, and I gave the mice celery to eat in that cage. But I found out that the mice from the blue cage were much heavier after 5 weeks. Thus, blue cages causes weight gain and yellow cages causes weight loss. If you wanted to lose weight, paint your house yellow. And you see the fallacy of that argument, that the color of the cage was not the variable. This research did not control for what the mice ate. It was actually what the mice ate. Now, in these 2 studies, they varied the type of metaphorical food given to their metaphorical mice and claimed it was the color of the cage that caused improved test scores. Let me explain. Both studies compared students who received individual tutoring to students who didn't receive individual tutoring. Small group, whole class. So one is left with 3 questions, none of which can be answered by controlled experimental research. Did Goldenberg not read the studies that he cited? Did he read the studies and not see the confounding variables? Or did he read the studies, see the anomaly, and make the citations anyway? We don't know. In these research, the conditions given to the treatment groups were much more favorable than those given to the control groups. Tutoring, specialized training for the tutors, observations and feedback given to the tutors, professional development. All these things were in the tutoring group or in the experimental group, but not in the remediation. Thus, you cannot say it's the type of instruction. It's all these other factors that are causing the change. It is most likely that the conditions, not the type of instruction, cause the differences in scores. And any type of instruction used with the experimental conditions in these two studies would likely outperform any type of instruction used with the control conditions. Experimental group, control group. Was it the type of instruction or was it the environmental conditions? So the results, did these studies in any way support explicit and systematic instruction? These weren't variables that were isolated. We don't know if or to what degree instruction in any group was more explicit and systematic than the other. We don't know about the type of instruction in the control groups. Did these studies support instruction of targeted knowledge and skills? And again, no, these were not variables isolated in the study. They were simply descriptors. We don't know exactly what knowledge and skills were targeted, and we don't know if the control group was any more targeted or less targeted than another. Did these studies in any way support instruction that focused on core skills? No, these weren't variables isolated. We don't know if or what degree the comparison groups contain these things. The descriptions found in the article were not aligned with research related to teaching specific core skills. We just don't know. Did both interventions include principles of early reading instruction consistent with findings from the research on the science of reading? These weren't identified. They weren't variables isolated. We don't know what the findings are. We don't know how consistent these principles are. And we don't know to what degree the groups differed in their consistency. So why did Goldenberg write these things in his article? We don't know. Conclusion, both these studies meet the basic science of reading research standards I've described, yet both are examples of bad research expertly conducted. And this bad research was creatively interpreted by Goldenberg to support the illusion of the efficacy of skills-based reading instruction for ELs. And I only analyzed one small portion of this article simply because I was familiar with the two studies. And imagine if I would go through the whole article, what I would find. In our scholarly writing, there's a big difference between using words to describe things in a study or in describe in a study and isolating variables in a research study. None of the words Goldenberg used were variables isolated in these studies. None of those words can be supported by research. Neither study supported the contention that improved reading scores were caused by explicit and systematic instruction of targeted knowledge and skills and daily lessons that included activities focused on the 5 core skills. This just isn't true. At best, we can say that Goldenberg used these words with extreme imprecision. We must critically evaluate all scholarly work. Don't be snookered by long sentences and important sounding words. Pull them apart to see what the authors are actually saying or not saying. Examine the propositions, examine the citations. This has been the Reading Instruction Show. I am your host, Dr. Andy Johnson.